Vladimir Putin overplayed his hand. He tried to bomb Ukraine into submission. He killed too many civilians. He wouldn't agree to the ceasefire. Trump got upset. Then the pendulum swung back in the summer, where you had the meeting between Putin and Trump in Alaska, but then it almost immediately swung back because Putin again would not agree to the ceasefire and give Trump that Nobel Peace Prize he wanted. It swung back in late October when the Kremlin got to Witkoff, got to Kushner to put forth the ultimatum, and then it swung back away from the Kremlin towards Ukraine in the past 3 months. So what I'm telling you here is that there's not a definitive answer how long this game can be played, because at this point, the Trump folks don't stop the pendulum swinging. You know, if we knew that the Trump administration, not just Trump, not just Witkoff, not just Kushner, all the U.S. agencies, if we knew that they were firmly locked into the security guarantees for Ukraine, if they were firmly locked into Ukraine getting a recovery, which first and foremost was for Ukraine and not for American profits, if we knew that they were locked into maintaining the front lines where Russia cannot seize more territory, the pendulum would stop. But we still don't know if the Trump folks are locked into that, because the guy in the White House is unpredictable, he's chaotic, and he's driven by his ego, as we've seen in the last 48 hours over a different case, which is the case of Greenland.
Are we in better position right now rather than at the beginning of the last year in terms of Ukraine war negotiations, support from Ukraine, and US policy on this? Are we in better position right now, at least?
I mean, with respect, that's kind of a question you need to put to Ukrainians, because they're the ones that are on the front line here, whether they're actually on the battlefront, whether they're having to take shelter, whether they've had to flee their homes. We're going through the most intense period, I think, of the missile and drone attempt to break Ukraine by breaking the energy infrastructure. This is a colder winter this year. You've got temperatures down to minus 20 Celsius. You've got more missiles and drones that are hitting the thermal power facilities, the hydroelectric facilities, even the threat, according to Ukraine intelligence, of trying to hit nuclear facilities or the substations supporting nuclear facilities. So Ukraine's got to come through that. That being said, at the start of 2025, and I don't think I was alone in this, my worry was that the U.S. would abandon Ukraine for good, that Donald Trump's ego, the positions of some of his advisors, especially the Vice President J.D. Vance, would be that there would be no more American help of any kind for Ukraine. So Europe and the rest of the international community would have to do it without the Americans. That has not come to pass, because you've got career officials who still believe that you need to defend Ukraine as part of European security, because I think you do have someone like Secretary of State Marco Rubio, who is not willing to walk away from Ukraine entirely. You still have American involvement here. And as I mentioned, you have a Ukraine-Europe proposal, which potentially has the U.S. being very much part of the security guarantees. I did not expect we would be at that point a year ago. I was not sure we would be at the point at the start of 2025 where the U.S. would continue to provide intelligence sharing. They are doing so. The CIA is cooperating very much with Ukraine in terms of targeting information inside Russia, for example. And at the start of 2025, we just did not know how much of the burden Europe could take up. And the Europeans, albeit too slowly at times, having to deal with problems like Hungary and Slovakia at times, the EU and individual European countries have maintained support for Ukraine. So, look, I've said this repeatedly, but I'm just going to emphasize, in February 2022, well before 2025, I was amongst people who thought Kyiv would fall within weeks. I'm not proud that I thought that. I just thought it wouldn't happen. At the start of 2025, we were back to the point of, could Ukraine continue to still stand? Could it continue to resist the Russian invasion? January 2026, Ukraine still resists the Russian invasion, and has done so, where despite a lot of the pain, the anguish of civilians getting killed, of civilians losing their homes, that the economy still largely works, that energy still hasn't been completely broken. Ukrainians still go to work. They still celebrate at times. They still try to live their lives. And to me, that's a big victory. Wherever this invasion winds up, that is a big victory that Ukraine still stands as we near the 4-year anniversary of the Russian full-scale invasion.
Let's cover also the breaking news from US. This weekend, US President Donald Trump announced new 10% tariff on European allies he says are opposing his push to buy or capture Greenland. Is this the end of the transatlantic union?
Oh, the Trump camp, not everybody in the Trump administration, but for Trump and many people around him, like the Vice President J.D. Vance, they don't believe in alliances, any alliances. But that includes the alliance with Europe that we've had since World War II. And that has included many countries that were formerly in the Soviet bloc after 1991 that potentially could involve Ukraine on a long-term basis. They don't believe in that. J.D. Vance said that last February, so this is not new. What is new here is that, and I can't believe I'm saying this to you, that we have the White House threatening a military invasion, which would put it at war with Denmark, a member of NATO, and with the rest of NATO. Because if the U.S. sent in troops, they could send in troops right now under the existing agreement with Denmark to their base that they have in Greenland, Pituffik. They could send it to bases that they reopened that were there during the Cold War. They can do that. If they send in the military as an invading force, as an occupying force, then NATO no longer exists the way that we've come to know it since 1949. And the Danish Prime Minister, Mette Frederiksen, made that very clear. At that point, if the United States invaded, every NATO member, as well as every member of the European Union, would have to decide whether they stand together to face off the Americans, not necessarily in a military war, but in terms of economic and political steps against the U.S., not as an ally, but as an enemy. Now, I don't think it will get to that point. I don't think that the Americans will invade militarily or the Trump people will invade militarily. But I do think that Trump, because he's a bully, because he wants to seize Greenland, he just likes to take things, because he hates to take no for an answer, I do think he'll keep trying to maintain the economic and political threats. So those tariffs, which will be 10% on February 1st, they could well be 25% come June. He could raise them even higher. But this is a red line. You know, we're not talking about an alliance now. We're talking about America being an adversary. We need to say that word. They are an adversary of Europe. And so Europe needs to stand together against this carefully. You'll see very careful public statements about still trying to keep the door open to negotiation with the Trump folks, trying to pull them back from the threats. But Europe has to prepare for the imposition of tariffs against the United States. They have to push back with their own economic tools if this is the way that Trump wants to play this.
Can you imagine a scenario in which Europeans fight against Americans on the ground?
Well, let me just tell you what's happening right now. First of all, remember that the Americans have around 150 troops who are in Greenland at the Pituffik base. The European countries, so that would have been Denmark plus 7 other European countries, the UK, France, Germany, Netherlands, Sweden, Finland, Norway. They've put in a handful of military personnel. But it was reported yesterday that the U.S. government was going to ready for deployment the Army 11th Airborne Division, 1,500 troops from that division. Now, the U.S. government said, oh, this is because they might go to Minnesota, where you've got, of course, the crackdown on the population of Minnesota, you know, some of which you've seen, the killing of Renee Nicole Good, the abuses, the intimidation, the beatings. But the Army's 11th Division is the only specialist Arctic division in the U.S. military. Minnesota's cold, but it's not part of the Arctic. Greenland is. Now, the White House has had to put out a disclaimer today and say, no. We're looking to deploy these 1,500 troops of this Arctic division to Minnesota, not to Greenland. But everybody's wondering if that's true. If they were to be deployed in Greenland, effectively as an occupying force, no, I don't think we're going to talk about the Europeans, including Denmark, that are going to send their military forces in that we have a ground war in Greenland. I think the response by Europe will be political and economic measures, but it will mean that the transatlantic relationship, the way that it has functioned over 80 years, it's gone. Because you cannot have a functioning economic relationship when the largest member in that relationship, the United States, has invaded another country's territory. And that's just going to be the start. The European Union will take diplomatic steps at the United Nations. They'll take it in other international fora. They will try to isolate the United States, because the one thing that I think is the silver lining, depending on how far the Trump people go with this, is the first people who will feel the pain of tariffs, whether it's Trump's tariffs, whether it's the EU response, will be Americans. And I would add this, that while I'm very worried, I do think that we shouldn't just put up our hands in despair, because there is a fundamental that only 14% of Americans support trying to seize Greenland, and only about 5% support trying to use military action to take it.
Also, US President Donald Trump is claiming that one of the reasons he's pushing to buy or capture Greenland is that he didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize, according to a message he sent to Norway's Prime Minister over the weekend. Is Trump's ego main reason behind this push?
Oh, it's certainly one reason why he wants to get Greenland. And he acts like my children used to do when they were 3 or 4 years old and they couldn't get what they wanted in a store. And maybe you know friends, or you yourself had this experience of having children who just stand and scream their heads off, I want, I want, I want. Well, Donald Trump, actually, let me back up a step. Let me explain what happened before Donald Trump sent his message to the presidents, the heads of Finland and Norway. The Finnish president, Alexander Stubb, and the Norwegian prime minister, Jonas Støre, they wrote Trump a really nice letter. They said, we would like to meet with you to discuss the security issues around Greenland. We want to work with you here. So they didn't say to Trump, stop threatening us. They didn't say, you know, you're actually lying about the security of Greenland. They said, we want to work with you on this. We will meet with you together, or we'll meet with you separately. And then they added an exclamation point, the way you do when you write a friend. Really excited, we'll meet you. And they said, yours sincerely, or best, Alex and Jonas. They used their first names. Trump then gave that reply that you have just mentioned, which is, Norway did not give me the Nobel Peace Prize. Now, the Norwegian government, it's not their decision who gets the Nobel Peace Prize. The Nobel Committee is an independent committee. But he wrote, Prime Minister Støre in Norway, because you did not give me the Nobel Peace Prize, I am no longer committed to, I no longer have to pursue peace. In other words, the president of peace can become the president of war now, because you upset his ego, because you did not give him his present. So this was a temper tantrum. This honestly, and people have asked me this morning, I've had friends who have asked me here in Ireland, is it genuine? Is he really genuinely think this? And I have to tell them, he does. He genuinely thinks that it all comes down to what he gets. And this is getting worse because Trump's mental and physical health are getting worse. There's a point probably where he knew that he was just trying to bully people. He knew this wasn't really real. He probably knew that the Nobel Peace Prize wasn't the Norwegian government's to give him. But that's gone. He now believes everything that he writes. He honestly believes that if you do not pay him tribute, then he has the right to punch you in the face.
Is there still a way forward on Greenland for US government, for the White House, even after this threats made to European allies?
Yes, there is, but it comes from elsewhere in Washington. The Trump administration is divided. J.D. Vance would like to seize Greenland because J.D. Vance, who wants to be president in 2029, he wants this as America is the only power in the world. We dominate everywhere. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth just wants to show military might, the macho warrior culture. The Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent went on the Sunday morning talk shows in America and loyally supported all of Trump's misinformation and disinformation. But Secretary of State Marco Rubio is far more cautious on this. He doesn't want to see a break with the Europeans. That's why the Europeans have been trying to talk to him rather than to Vance or directly to Trump to start with. And there are many career officials in the State Department, in the intelligence services, in the military, in the financial departments, including the Treasury, whose careers were built on cooperation with Europe. You know, that's been the position since the 1940s. But importantly, in this case, there are many Republicans in Congress who don't like what Trump is doing. They don't like what Trump is doing because some Republicans still believe in the idea of cooperation over European security, going back to the days of Ronald Reagan, or before that, Dwight Eisenhower. Many Republicans know that they would get hurt if there's a break between the U.S. and Europe economically. And they know that most Americans, the large majority of Americans, don't want to do this. So that's the way back. The way back is for Europe to work on those channels, to work on those within the administration, to work on those members of Congress, to work on the wider American public to say, look, we want to cooperate with you. We want to cooperate in terms of European security, but you have to respect our red lines here, which is you don't go in and steal another nation's territory.
Can Donald Trump overplay his hand in this matter of Greenland, or did he already overplay his hand?
He's already overplayed his hand. I mean, and he's overplayed his hand because you always have to think what your next step is when you pursue this. Now, in the case of Venezuela, let's just back up a few weeks. Remember when Venezuela was in the news? And the Trump administration kidnapped Nicolas Maduro, the president. They took him away. They took some of Venezuela's oil that was already sitting in tankers, but they didn't think through their next step, right? And so they were in a position of, wait a minute, we're not going to be able to get rid of the Maduro government or Maduro regime. So it was like, okay, now we have to accept that there's a Maduro government regime in which the vice president has become acting president, the interior minister, the defense minister is still there. Trump hadn't thought through his next step on the oil industry. He just simply said, oh, U.S. oil companies are going to go in and they're going to take over the Venezuelan oil company. And oil companies were saying either publicly or privately, look, we're not ready to invest billions of dollars to do that. We don't think the situation's secure enough. Now, in the case of Greenland, what they've done is they have said, oh, we could use military action on this, force on this, or we could use economic action against this. So sell us Greenland. And that's the offer they made to the Danes. And Denmark said, no, we're not going to sell you Greenland. And people in Greenland said, the large majority have said, we don't want to be part of the United States. And they haven't thought through their step after that. You know, do they then send in troops to occupy Greenland? And guess what? If you occupy Greenland, even fewer people in Greenland will want to be part of an occupying force. That's the way these things works, folks. They haven't thought through the fact that if they offered what's called this Compact of Free Association, the U.S. gets primary economic links with Greenland. It's responsible for Greenland's defense and foreign policy. They haven't thought through the fact that, first of all, Denmark would have to agree to that. And then secondly, Greenland would have to agree to that, having become independent. So this is the way Trump operates. Trump operates where he tries to bully people into submission before he has to go to the next step. But if the people he's trying to bully say, stop, we don't agree, then he's lost. And I think that's where we are right now. And I will add the fact that in the past 48 hours, I have been impressed. Europe can move too slowly at times. It can be a bit cumbersome at times. We know that. You know that in Ukraine. But in this case, the Europeans have coordinated their messages where almost every European leader, and indeed almost every European party, including parties supported by Trump, have come out and said, no, this is not acceptable. We're not going to stand for this.
And final question for you regarding this hilarious news about Putin joining Board of Peace. The Kremlin has announced that Vladimir Putin has been invited to join Donald Trump's Board of Peace set up last week with the intention that it would oversee a ceasefire in Gaza. Is this a joke?
Not in Trump world, it's not. No, and it's the type of black comedy that used to. One of my favorite writers is George Orwell. I assume you've probably read Orwell, which is a war is peace, right? And here we are. That the man who has committed war against Ukraine has unfortunately committed mass murder of many Ukrainians, who has stolen many of Ukraine's children, that he gets to be a man of peace on the peace board for Gaza. Well, how do you get to this point? Because Donald Trump doesn't think in terms of morality. He doesn't think in terms of ethics. He thinks in terms of what makes Donald Trump look good. And Donald Trump wants to be president of the world. So when it comes to Gaza, despite the fact that we have a very fragile ceasefire there, despite the fact that people in Gaza are still getting killed, still face shortages of food, face shortages of housing, he says, okay, we're ready to move to the next phase. We're ready to move to the next phase. And on this Board of Peace, I will have, and on the executive board that's underneath it, I'll have, let's see, Jared Kushner, my son-in-law, he'll be on the board. Steve Witkoff, the real estate developer, he'll be on the board. Tony Blair, who was involved in the war on Iraq in 2003, he'll be on the board. And then he goes, oh, well, why don't we just have an important person like Vladimir Putin who's on the board? In other words, he just grabs these quite important figures because he thinks they will either have to pay tribute to them or they'll like him a bit more. And he says, come be on this board. Now, the story beyond the story here, the serious point beyond the black comedy is that Israel has already objected to this Board of Peace. They've objected to it because they do not want anyone from Turkey or Qatar on it. And Trump has named the Turkish president, Recep Erdogan, as well as a leading Qatari official on that. So I don't think the Gaza executive board or above it, the Board of Peace. You have the Board of Peace, then the executive board. Then you finally have the Gaza administration. I don't think this is actually going to see the light of day. But let me give you something that extends the black comedy further. This isn't the only Board of Peace that Donald Trump wants to set up. Donald Trump is also saying he wants to set up a Board of Peace for Venezuela. And he wants to set up a Board of Peace for Ukraine. Now, thank goodness he has not yet approached Vladimir Putin to be on the Board of Peace for Ukraine. But never say never. What Trump has also said is, by the way, if you want to be on my Board of Peace, you got to pay me $1 billion. A billion with a B. So in other words, Donald Trump is not interested in peace. He's interested in making money by selling his idea of peace. And once you realize that's what's happening, then yeah, why not have a warmonger like Vladimir Putin to be part of his little game?
Thank you, Professor Lucas, for your insightful answers and another in-depth conversation, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to the heroes. Best to you, Daniel. Best to all your great viewers.